By early 1966, Jimi Hendrix was a very experienced guitar player, playing in several bands, like the Isley Brothers and Little Richard and his band called the Upsetters, as well as Ike and Tina Turner, the Ronettes, and for several other lesser known groups at the time, such as Curtis Knight and the Squires. He also played for a lot of solo artists, playing for legends like Ray Charles, Sam Cooke, Jackie Wilson, Wilson Pickett. He even backed Percy Sledge before he had a hit with When a Man Loves a Woman. Jimmy also became a very experienced session guitar player, playing on several albums and singles for several bands and solo artists such as the Isley Brothers and Little Richard. In fact, while Jimmy was playing in Little Richard's band called the Upsetters, Jimmy played on 2 songs for Little Richard. The first one ended up being released as a single, and it's a beautiful little song in my opinion, called I Don't Know What You've Got, But You've Got Me. Part 1 on the A side and part 2 on the B side. The single was released in the US 1st of October 1965. The other song that Jimmy played on at that same recording session for Little Richard back in 1964 was a song called Dancing All Around the World, which ended up being a track that was eventually released on Little Richard's album called Mr. Big, released in 1971. Let's hear from the legend himself, Little Richard, who some still regard, including myself, as the true king of rock and roll.
I met Jimmy in Atlanta, Georgia. He was stranded, and his name wasn't Jimi Hendrix, it was Maurice James. And on the stage, he would actually take the show. You know, people would scream, and I think they're screaming for me, and I look over in the corner screaming for Jimmy, so I had to darken the lights and have the lights on over here. Don't put nothing back there. You know, he'd be back there playing the guitar with his teeth.
Jimmy also played on the original recording sessions for Don Covey and the Good Timers for their single called Mercy Mercy. Jimmy also played on the B-side of the single, a song called Can't Stay Away. The single Mercy Mercy was released August 1964. The single reached number 35 in the US charts. It also reached number 1 in the US Cashbox R&B charts. Mercy Mercy was a song that would later be covered by the Rolling Stones, which was a track that was released on their album called Out of Our Heads, which was originally released in the US on the 30th of July 1965 and released in the UK on the 24th of September 1965. While Jimi Hendrix was still in Little Richard's band called the Upsetters, he made his first TV appearance on a TV music show called Night Train, where he can be seen backing a duo called Buddy and Stacy, performing a cover version of Junior Walker's Night Train, broadcast in the US 1965. Jimmy started to become frustrated at being a sideman for many groups and solo artists, and didn't really like being told what to play and how to play it. So, in the summer of 1966, Jimmy decided to form his own group and call himself and the band Jimmy James and the Blue Flames, with a 15-year-old guitar player called Randy Craig Wolf. But Jimmy decided to give him the stage name of Randy California. Young Randy must have loved his new stage name, because he kept it and went on to form the rock group Spirit. The Blue Flames became the house band at the Cafe War Club, Greenwich Village, New York. On the 2nd of July 1966, the Rolling Stones arrived in New York to perform at the Forest Hill Tennis Stadium Music Festival. So, this was the time when Keith Richards' girlfriend, model Linda Keith, walked into the Cafe War and saw Jimi Hendrix perform. Here's Linda Keith to tell us in more detail what the atmosphere was like that night at the Cafe War, but more importantly, to tell us what was it like watching Jimi Hendrix perform live on stage for the first time.
In 1966, I was going up with Keith Richards of the Rolling Stones, and one night Keith was on tour and I was with a bunch of friends, so I was in New York just hanging out, and we ended up in a club. The guy on guitar completely blew my mind.
As soon as the Blue Flames finished their set for the night, she quickly rushed backstage to introduce herself. She said to Jimmy that she knew some record label executives and producers that would love to sign him, and she'd bring a few of them down to the club to watch him perform. She also said to Jimmy, "You need a decent guitar to play," so she lent him this beautiful Olympic white 1964 Fender Stratocaster with a rosewood neck that belonged to her boyfriend Keith Richards. Shortly afterwards, Linda brought the Rolling Stones manager Andrew Loog Oldham, who also brought the Rolling Stones to see Jimmy. But unfortunately, Jimmy's performance that night was lackluster. Andrew turned round to Linda and said, "What's so special about this guy? You said he was the greatest performer, the most exciting guitarist you've ever seen. He's nothing of the sort." Personally speaking, I can't believe that Jimmy's performance was lackluster because he was shy in front of the Rolling Stones. Not after he's played for legends like Ray Charles and Little Richard, knowing how demanding Little Richard was. And let's not forget, part of the reason Little Richard sacked Jimmy was because he kept upstaging him on stage, apparently. I was fortunate enough to have met the former Rolling Stones bass player, Bill Wyman, after a brilliant performance with his new band at the time called the Rhythm Kings, backstage at the Fairfield Halls, Croydon, South London, Monday the 5th of June 2000. He told me Jimmy's performance that night was brilliant and couldn't understand why Andrew didn't sign him. It will be a decision that Andrew will soon regret. Not long afterwards, Linda brought in American music executive Seymour Stein to see Jimmy. Only this time, Jimmy was in much better form, but overcome with enthusiasm, he started to smash the guitar. Seymour was so shocked, he turned to Linda and said, "This guy's much too wild for me," and walked out. Linda was so angry at Jimmy, she shouted and said, "Remember, you're only borrowing the guitar." But Jimmy couldn't have damaged the guitar that badly, 'cause that's the same guitar Jimmy flew to London with and used on the early recording sessions with the Experience. Seymour Stein would later help British producer Mike Vernon launch his label Blue Horizon, where Mike Vernon would also produce and sign Peter Green's Fleetwood Mac to the label. Seymour must have regretted not signing Jimmy that night, because he would later go on to sign bands like the Ramones, Talking Heads, Echo and the Bunnymen. He was also responsible for discovering Madonna. Oh my good God. Oh well. Anyway. 1st of July 1966, the Animals started their US tour. It would be the last tour for the original band members. Well, apart from lead singer Eric Burdon. But it definitely was for the Animals bass player, Brian James Chaz Chandler, who wanted to change careers slightly and stop being a musician and concentrate on management and music production. While Chaz was in the States, he heard this song, written by, allegedly, singer-songwriter Billy Roberts and performed by American folk singer Tim Rose, called Hey Joe. Let's hear from Chaz Chandler.
I'd been out the night before with a girlfriend of mine, and she'd played me a recording by Tim Rose of Hey Joe. And he'd been out about 10 months, I think, in America at the time. It was very folky, great song. And I said, at the end of this tour, I'm going to go back to England and find an artist to record this song with.
On the 2nd of August 1966, Linda bumped into Chaz Chandler. Here's Linda to explain in more detail and to tell us exactly how she managed to persuade Chas Chandler to go to the Cafe War and see who she thought could be the biggest star since Elvis Presley.
I was introduced to Chas Chandler from the Animals. He was saying how he wanted to get out of the Animals, how he wanted to get into production and management. And I said, well, I happen to have an artist that you'll be very, very interested in. Come on down to Cafe War tomorrow afternoon and check him out.
On Wednesday afternoon, on the 3rd of August, 1966, Chas Chandler went to the Cafe War with Linda Keith to see Jimi Hendrix perform. And he was absolutely blown away by his performance, especially the way Jimmy performed one song. Here's Chas Chandler.
Bumped into Linda in a club and she said there was this lad in the village who was brilliant, I should see. So I went there with her the next day to a little club called the Cafe War in Greenwich Village, which was a little coffee house really with musicians playing downstairs. And saw Jimmy playing there. The most amazing coincidence was the first song he played was Hey Joe. And it was, you just stood there as if like fate had just taken a hand. There was, you know, that was it. I knew what I was going to do when the Animals broke up. I was going to bring Hendrix to England and record Hey Joe.
After Jimmy had finished performing, Chas Chandler rushed backstage and said to Jimmy, "Look, I think you're really talented. Why don't you come to England with me and I'll make you a star. And when you come back to the States, you'll be bigger than Elvis." Jimmy was surprised, especially when it was one of the Animals raving about him. Chas carried on and said, "Look, I'm good friends with the Beatles and the Stones, and when they see you, they're going to be absolutely amazed with your performance. Believe me." Here's Chas Chandler.
We sat talking. He had a lot of doubts about coming to England. His actual words to me at the time was, "What's the point in me going to England as a guitar player?" He says, "You've got Eric Clapton and Jeff Beck over there." He says, "You don't need one more guitar player." And I said, "Well, I'm sure that if Eric and Jeff see you, that they're going to end up like admiring your playing." I said, "You know," he said, and he turned around. He says, "Well, look," he says, "I know you know Eric and all that, because, you know, Yardbirds days and all this." He said, "If you guarantee me he'll introduce us to Eric Clapton, I'll come to London."
Chas would have been delighted to have taken Jimmy back to England a lot sooner than he did. But unfortunately, he had one more contractual commitment that he had to do before starting his new career as a manager and as a producer. Here's Chas Chandler.
The last Animals tour, this was in about July. Our tour of America was finishing in September, late September. I said I'd come straight back to New York, pick you up and take you to London. And he said, "I'll be here." And that's how I met Hendrix.
Apparently, Jimmy got in contact with his old army buddy, bass player Billy Cox, who he formed the King Casuals with, and asked him whether he would like to go with him to London and join his new group. But sadly, Billy declined and said for the time being he was happy working in Nashville. When Chas Chandler returned to New York, he managed to get Jimmy a passport and a first-class plane ticket, all paid for by Chas Chandler's business partner and Jimmy's co-manager, the Animals manager, Michael Jeffrey. On the evening of the 23rd of September 1966, Chas Chandler and Jimi Hendrix left New York's John F. Kennedy Airport to board Pan Am Flight 102 to London. Apart from Keith Richards' white Fender Stratocaster, the only other thing that Jimmy took with him on the plane to London that night as hand luggage was a small bag containing a change of clothes, some hair curlers, and a jar of Valderma cream for his acne. The drummer from John Hammond's band, Charles Otis, gave Jimmy $40, which was the only money he had in his pocket when he got on the plane to London. On Saturday, the 24th of September 1966, James Marshall Hendrix arrived at London's Heathrow Airport at 9 a.m. in the morning, UK time. For the time being, Jimmy only had a visitor's visa, which was arranged by his co-manager, Michael Jeffrey, who is on the far left of this photograph. Jeffrey sent his press officer, Tony Garland, To meet Jimmy and Chaz at the airport, Tony had to spend 2 hours with UK immigration. He was told to say to them by Jeffrey that Jimmy was this famous musician who had come to England to pick up some music royalties that he was owed. And then, amazingly, that's how Jimmy got a 1-week visitor's visa. Now, to me, that was incredible. I mean, you can say what you like about Michael Jeffrey, especially the way he handled Jimmy later on. But I've got to hand it to him. He definitely knew what to say and what strings to pull, because pretty soon after that, he managed to get Jimmy a proper working visa. Let's hear from Trixie Lennox, who used to work at Michael Jeffrey's management company at the time.
Chaz was very essential for what he did for Jimmy, but without Mike, it would have gone nowhere. Mike really was a very clever negotiator and wheeler-dealer.
I would have to agree with Trixie there. There was no way Chaz Chandler could have ever brought Jimmy to the UK without Michael Jeffrey's financial help. And as it turned out, it was Jeffrey who had the real power and pulled the strings in their partnership. Chaz Chandler's real job, in all honesty, was like as a music director and producer. Chaz was a friendly, outgoing guy, a Geordie from Newcastle. Born on the 18th of December 1938, Chaz was well liked and respected amongst his friends, like the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, and many others in the entertainment business. Michael Jeffrey, on the other hand, was born in Peckham, South London, on the 4th of March 1933, was a privately educated man, and spoke several languages, including Russian. The people who I have met who've had the misfortune of dealing with him said that he was a ruthless, tough type of manager and should not be messed around with, because apparently Jeffrey did have links to organised crime. Which isn't surprising, considering London was run by villains like the Cray twins and the Richardsons. Apparently, Michael Jeffrey saw himself more like James Bond than Al Capone, because he did used to say that he was a secret agent for the British Secret Service. So come on, Chaz, tell us what Michael Jeffrey was really like to work with.
He had a very convoluted mentality. He was like an idiot genius, you know. I think he got more thrill out of stealing a pound than earning a pound, you know. So the way his brain flowed, devious bugger.
On the way home from the airport, Jimmy and Chaz stopped by at the flat of musician George Bruno Money, better known by his stage name as Zoot Money, where he lived with his wife, Ronnie, which was at 11 Gunstone Road, West Kensington, London. According to Zoot, the reason why Chaz and Jimmy stopped by their flat that morning was because Chaz wanted to get in contact with Zoot's guitarist at the time, a young man called Andy Summers, who Zoot formed the Big Roll Band with, to ask Andy if he had a spare guitar to borrow, or even better, if he knew anyone who had any left-handed guitars, because Jimmy was scheduled to play a gig later that night and needed a guitar to play, because apparently Jimmy didn't have one. But unfortunately, Andy, who lived below Zoot in a basement flat, who 11 years later would have great success when he forms a band with a singer from Newcastle called Gordon Sumner, better known by his stage name as Sting, along with a drummer from America called Stuart Copeland, called The Police. According to Zoot Money, he said that Chaz used Zoot's telephone to get in contact with Andy, but he wasn't in. So Zoot said to Jimmy that he could borrow his guitar, which he bought second hand in January or February of 1966. It was an Italian-made guitar called a Vondre Teenager Blue Jean See-Through model, which was actually created by Italian artist and sculptor Antonio Vondre Pioli. Anyway, Zoot gives Jimmy the guitar so he could play it to see how it felt. Here's Zoot Money himself to tell us what it was really like to hear Jimmy play his Vondre guitar.
Jimmy was sitting there, you know, we were chatting about music and blues and stuff, and he was playing, fiddling around, really just playing my electric guitar, which I had there because I bought it because I used to write on the guitar, and I had this guitar which is very cheap, but it was like it was an Italian fetish guitar, I think they called them. very weird. But it was a right-handed, and I said, and he loved the way the action on it. I said, well, you can borrow that if you want. You can restring it, but I don't think it'll stand up to the electronics because I think you'll be looking for something else. Anyway, while this was going on, he was playing. It was obvious that he was even playing a guitar to him upside down because it was the right way round and he's left-handed. It was obvious and I formed the friendship there and then with him. I thought, great, he's just good, and he was very easy to get on with, Jimmy. Very, what do you call it? Respectful, almost shy. I mean, almost totally shy off stage. Really would not offend people at all. So anyway, he obviously had been told by Chaz that, I was the big cheese around London at the time. And if I knew of anybody who was left-handed, if anybody did know, it would be me or Andy, who was the thing. But Andy wasn't there at the time. He wasn't there. So I couldn't actually get into his flat and nick a guitar and give it to him. Andy would have killed me anyway.
Yeah, well, Zoo, it's a nice story, even though I do believe that it was the first guitar Jimmy ever played in the UK. You know, as well as I do, that Chaz would never have let Jimmy leave America without a decent guitar. Still, the story turned out to be a nice bit of providence when he sold it through Garden Holgate Auctioneers, Horsham, Wiltshire, UK. The Wampara, as he used to call it, went under the hammer on the 14th of September 2017 and sold for £5,952, which isn't bad considering Zoot told me he only bought it for 18 quid back in 1966. If Zoot Money comes to your area to perform, definitely go and see him, because he still rocks and he's still got a great voice, and I've had the privilege of meeting him and seeing him several times. He's a great guy with a brilliant sense of humour and an absolute legend. Living above the flat of Zoot and Ronnie Money in those days was a young 20-year-old hairdresser and DJ called Kathy Etchingham. Here's Kathy Etchingham as she tells us her memories of that legendary morning on the 24th of September 1966.
Ronnie, Zoot's wife, came upstairs and said, "Oh, you must come down and see this guy that Chaz has brought back from America. He looks like the wild man of Borneo." But I'd gone to bed late that night, and this was like 11 o'clock in the morning. And I said, "Oh, look, I can't be bothered." And she said, "Well, we're all going to go down to the Scotch of St. James's later, so, you can come down with us because he's going to be playing there."
Later that evening, Chaz took Jimmy to the Scotch of St. James Club, 13 Mason's Yard, St. James, London, SW1. Also in attendance that evening was the usual rock stars, the Beatles, Rolling Stones, Eric Burdon, Linda Keith. But playing on stage that night was a little blues band called the VIPs. Jimmy, confidently, with Keith Richards' white Stratocaster in his hand, walked up to the stage and asked the VIP's bass player, Greg Ridley, if he could jam with them. And to Jimmy's surprise, Greg casually said, "Yeah." As soon as Jimmy plugged in the guitar and began playing, heads started to turn in the audience and mouths started to open in disbelief. Greg would later say that he couldn't believe the sound that Jimmy could generate from his guitar. It was like a completely new sound, like it came from another world. Even the VIP's young keyboard player, Keith Emerson, said that Jimmy's sound was completely different than, say, Eric Clapton, Jeff Beck, Jimmy Page, even Peter Green, who had only recently replaced Eric Clapton as lead guitarist in John Mayall's Blues Breakers, and would later go on and form Fleetwood Mac. Here's Mick Fleetwood to tell us what his reaction was like when he first saw Jimi Hendrix perform.
I remember sitting there with Peter Green. Everyone was down there saying, okay, what's this all about? And Hendrix came on and proceeded to blow everyone's minds.
After Jimmy played a few blues numbers with the VIPs. For about 5 minutes or so, Chandler rushed to the stage in a panic and dragged Jimmy off the stage, saying to the boys in the band, sorry, he's not allowed to perform, even for free, because he's only got a visitor's visa and not a working visa, and very quickly led Jimmy back to the table where Linda Keith and the rest of them were sitting. I think that brief play that the VIPs had with Jimmy on stage that night must have had an effect on them, because later they would split up and reform and call themselves Spooky Tooth. And then bass player Greg Ridley, after forming Spooky Tooth, would leave and meet up with Small Faces singer and guitarist Steve Marriott, along with another young guitarist from Beckenham, Peter Frampton, to form one of my favourite rock bands, Humble Pie. But I think that Jimmy's playing that night had even more of an influence on the VIP's keyboard player, Keith Emerson, because pretty soon afterwards he would leave the VIPs and form the psychedelic progressive rock group, The Nice, and then in the 1970s would go on to have great success when he forms the legendary Emerson, Lake and Palmer. If you look at Keith Emerson's stage performance, particularly the way he used to bang on the keyboard and tip it upside down or sideways, it's very similar to what Jimmy used to do with the guitar. And I do think if Jimmy lived long enough, say to the late 70s, he would have definitely done something with electronic music. And it would have been very interesting to hear how Jimmy would have used the synthesizer or the drum machine, which I'm sure he would have introduced in some shape or form into his music. Shortly after Chaz stopped Jimmy from playing with the VIPs, Kathy Etchingham suddenly appeared at the club. Here's Kathy to tell you exactly what happened next from an interview she did a few years ago.
Jimmy was sitting with Linda Keith, and Linda Keith went to the ladies or went somewhere, and Jimmy called me over, and I sat where she'd been sitting, and we started talking. When she came back, she somehow got into an argument with Ronnie Money, and Ronnie, being from the Gorbals, Scottish Dynamite, objected to what she'd said and was protective about me, and some sort of fight broke out. Plates were being flung around and everything. And Chaz said to me, get Jimmy back to the Hyde Park Towers Hotel. It's in Inverness Terrace.
In a telephone interview for a radio station in Seattle, Kathy Etchingham gave a more detailed story of what happened to her and Jimmy after the fight between Linda Keith and Ronnie Money, and to find out exactly why Chaz asked her to get Jimmy out of the club and get him to the Hyde Park Towers Hotel as soon as possible.
Because if the police had been called, Jimmy was there on a sort of just visitor's visa. Chaz didn't want any trouble. This was his investment. And so I took him out of the club and we walked up to Piccadilly from St. James's, and I basically saved his life because he looked left instead of right. I walked into the road and there was a taxi.
You stopped him from being run over.
Yeah, the cars go the other
whole
way.
career.
I grabbed the back of his coat. He had this sort of Mac thing. Grabbed him by the back of his coat and pulled him back. He was hit by the wing mirror only, so he wasn't injured.
Well, but I mean, that just but for a few inches changes the course.
Well, it actually hit him.
Yeah.
It actually hit his chest.
Wow.
But only slightly, so he wasn't injured, no.
So did you start?
I said, you've got to look, when you cross the road, you've got
Yes.
to look to your right, not your left.
Silly American.
After Jimmy's near-death experience with the London taxi, Kathy and Jimmy finally reached their destination, the Hyde Park Towers Hotel, 41 to 51 Inverness Terrace, London, W2, 3JN, where Kathy and Jimmy ended up staying for 3 months, which was, according to this poster, which is now hung on the wall in the actual room where Jimmy and Kathy stayed in. It says, Jimi Hendrix First London Home, September to December 1966. You actually can still stay in the room Jimmy actually stayed in at the Hyde Park Towers Hotel. I recently spoke to Alison Aldridge, who was a 21-year-old receptionist who was working at the hotel at the time. said that Jimmy got on so well with the members of staff there. They threw a surprise party for him to celebrate his 24th birthday on the 27th of November 1966. Just before Kathy and Jimmy moved out of the hotel permanently, the staff also threw a farewell party for Jimmy. Jimmy and Kathy, along with Jimmy's manager, Chas Chandler, and his Swedish girlfriend at the time, Lotta Noel, moved into 34 Montague Square, Marylebone, London. They rented the flat for £30 a month from their landlord at the time, the Beatles drummer, Ringo Starr. After 3 months or so, Ringo had to evict Jimmy from the property because, according to Ringo, Jimmy, after a bad acid trip, whitewashed the walls of the property. Chas Chandler very quickly moved himself and Jimmy, along with their girlfriends, to 43 Upper Berkeley Street, London. Chas Chandler, to give him credit, had always been a man of his word and hadn't forgotten that he promised Jimmy back in New York that he would get Eric Clapton to jam with him. On the 1st of October 1966, the Cream were actually performing at the Regent Street Polytechnic, central London, now called the University of Westminster. Apparently, a few hours before the gig, Chas Chandler bumped into the Cream's bass player, Jack Bruce, and asked him if Jimmy could jam with the Cream. But according to this radio interview Jack Bruce did years ago, he wasn't too sure whether it was Chas or Jimmy that approached him that afternoon.
Well, probably wasn't chance, but it seemed like chance at the time. I met Jimmy in a pub and just opposite the gig, and he asked to sit in, and I said okay. And I took him, we went across, and Ginger wasn't too keen on him sitting in. Surprise, surprise.
Let's listen to Eric Clapton tell us his own story of how he met Jimi Hendrix.
We came backstage and there was Jimmy, and he was really already pretty freaky looking, with big hair and all those Cossack jackets on and skin-tight jeans, but with these beautiful eyes and a beautiful voice and just a marvellous manner, a real kind of gentleman, a very soft, charming guy. And I just took one look at him and knew that there was something powerful going on, and he got his guitar out and he said, would it be all right if he jammed? And I said, sure, yeah, if it's all right with the guys. And then Ginger was a bit, I don't know about this, and Jack was all right.
Jimi Hendrix walked on stage with the Cream and plugged into Jack Bruce's bass amp. And, well, I'll let Eric Clapton explain what happened next.
Jimmy came on and stole the show. I mean, did his whole repertoire. He did a Howling Wolf, a fast Howling Wolf song, very powerful. And he played the guitar behind his head, between his legs, with his teeth, slapped it around on the ground a bit, and I just went, yeah, this is it, this guy is bound for glory.
That's interesting, Eric, because according to Chas Chandler, and for that matter, Kathy Etchingham, they both say that your reaction to Jimi Hendrix's performance that night was completely different. Let's listen to Chas Chandler as he tells us how he remembers Eric Clapton's reaction to Jimi Hendrix's performance that night.
And Eric's hands were like this on the guitar, and they just dropped at his side. And he just stood there looking at Jimmy, and he walked up the stage. And I thought, oh dear, I knew this was going to happen. I ran backstage, and Eric was standing trying to light a cigarette, His hands were shaking. He just says, is he really that good?
Here's Kathy Etchingham.
We all went away looking a bit smug. And after that, I mean, there was a slight sort of thing between Eric Clapton and Jimmy. I don't care what anybody says,
Michael Jeffrey and Chas Chandler still needed to get Jimmy a working visa. In order to do that, they needed Jimmy to go on tour as soon as possible. Michael Jeffrey and Chas Chandler also knew that in order for Jimmy to go on tour, he needed his own band. Initially, Jimmy wanted to form his own big band with a keyboard player. Chas Chandler phoned up and asked Brian Auger from Brian Auger and the Trinity, but he wasn't interested. And to be fair, he did only just form the Brian Auger and the Trinity. He wanted to be leader of his own band with a beautiful lead singer called Julie Driscoll. There was also another reason why Brian didn't want to join the group.
Mike Jeffrey, man, I wanted absolutely nothing to do with this guy, and I thought he was an out-and-out crook.
Sadly, Brian, you were proven right about Mike, especially the way he dealt with the band's finances. But more on that a little bit later on. Chas Chandler, from the moment he saw Jimmy play in New York, wanted to form a three-piece group around him, and eventually managed to persuade Jimmy, saying, "Look, you're the one that everyone wants to see. You're the one with the guitar, and you're the one who would be a perfect leader in his own three-piece band, just like Eric Clapton and Cream." Jimmy understood what Chas was saying and agreed. David Noel Redding was a 20-year-old guitar player from Folkestone in Kent, born on the 25th of December 1945, who turned professional at 17 and played guitar in various bands including Neil Landon and the Burnett's, The Loving Kind and the Lonely Ones. Noel Redding came down from Kent to London that afternoon to audition for a totally different band. Anyway, here's Noel Redding to explain exactly what happened.
I had a melody maker, and there was a thing saying there was an audition for Eric Burdon and the New Animals, as they'd just broken up. So I went down to this audition and played a bit of guitar, but I gather they'd already got a guitar player. At which point Chas Chandler came over to me, and Chas a big star, and I was 20 years old, and I'm sort of all awestruck, and he said, "Can you play bass?" And I said, "No, but I'll give it a go."
He says, "I'm skint, I'll try anything." So I lent him my bass, went down to I think it was a place called Birdland, where Jimmy was having a bit knocking around with a guitar. He actually was trying out amplifiers, and Noel came down, used my bass, and we just said, "Right, that's him."
We played 3 tunes with no vocals, and this American gentleman said, "Can I have a chat with you?" So just next door to this place, which is just off Jermyn Street, there's this little pub. He asked me all about the English music scene, at which point that was like The Move, the Small Faces, the Beatles, the Stones, etc., etc. And I asked him all about the American music scene, as I'd never been there. Has he ever seen Sam Cooke? And he said, "I played with him." I said, "Oh, geez." And he said to me, would I join his group? And that was Mr. Hendrix.
Chas and Jimmy had been auditioning several of the UK's best drummers that were around at the time. But after a long and tedious audition process, they finally managed to whittle it down to just 2 drummers. But the 2 drummers they saw on the final day of auditions were so talented that both Chas and Jimmy couldn't decide which one to pick. Here's Chas Chandler to explain what happened next.
And it was a toss-up between Ainsley Dunbar and Mitch Mitchell, and literally we spun a coin. We couldn't make our minds up, and it fell for Mitch, you know.
Mitch Mitchell was a 20-year-old drummer born John Graham Mitchell on the 9th of July 1946, Ealing, Middlesex, London. Mitch had first become successful in the UK as a 12-year-old child actor, then known simply by his original name of John Mitchell, playing the lead of schoolboy Jennings in the BBC One television series Jennings at School, which had 10 episodes, which were broadcast on the 6th of September 1958 until the 8th of November 1958. Sadly, all the episodes of Jennings at School have been wiped by the BBC in the early 1970s. The young John Mitchell was also cast in a similar role, only this time as naughty private school schoolboy Peregrine Wendover, in the classic British comedy film Bottoms Up, starring British character actor Jimmy Edwards and Melvin Hayes, who would later go on to star in the British sitcom of the 1970s It Ain't Our Fault Mum. But for me, the nice thing about this film for me is it has one of my favourite actors in it, albeit in a minor role, a young Richard Bryars, who would later go on to star in not one, but 2 of his own British sitcoms, The Good Life and Ever Decreasing Circles. The film Bottoms Up, released in the UK on the 8th of March 1960. The film is broadcast occasionally on television and is available to buy on DVD. But for the young John Mitchell, music was his first love. That when he was 13, he took a part-time job at Marshall's Music Shop, Hanwell High Street, Ealing, London, where he also apparently received drumming lessons from the owner of the music shop, Jim Marshall, who is now probably best remembered for inventing the Marshall amplifier. But what a lot of people may not know about the late Jim Marshall, as well as being an electrical engineer, he was actually a professional jazz drummer and played with several jazz bands across the country. It was whilst working in the shop that the young John Mitchell got to know the musicians that came into the shop. One of the first bands he joined during those early days was a band called Pete Nelson and the Travellers. What is surprising to know, well at least for me, is that the guitarist for the Travellers, Vic Briggs, seen here on the top right of this photograph, would later go on and join Eric Burdon and the Animals, and I'm pretty sure he was the one who they chose to be the guitarist for Eric's new group, over Noel Redding, at the auditions. And I'm pretty sure that it was at this time that the young John Mitchell, while he was with the Travellers, that he decided to change his name from John Mitchell to Mitch Mitchell, which probably was wise, come to think about it now, to distance himself from being a child actor and to try and get more jobs as a professional musician, which it did work because he ended up being a really good session musician, as well as joining several other bands, such as the Riot Squad and Georgie Fame and the Blue Flames. It was while Mitch was in the Blue Flames, after a reasonably successful album and a tour, that he was surprisingly given the sack along with the other members of Georgie's group. Here's Mitch Mitchell to explain what happened next.
I got a phone call from Chaz, the Chandler. Hey, I've got this guy coming over from America. Do you fancy having a play with him? I just walked into this little basement in Soho, and very, very sort of dingy club, you know, in mid-afternoon, and there's a guy with pretty wild hair, but like a Burberry raincoat, you know, sort of like Sir Humphrey Bogart. Very quiet, very unassuming guy. And he was the first person I knew, ever heard, that knew how to play that Curtis Mayfield style of guitar. And also, oh, you want Wes Montgomery? I mean, without being a flash kid.
According to Noel Redding, it was Michael Jeffrey that came up with the band's name, the Jimi Hendrix Experience. Again, Jimmy wasn't sure whether it would be a good idea to have his name actually as the group's title. Apparently, he would have preferred to have a name more like the Cream, the Yardbirds, or the Who. Jeffrey, to give him credit, told the young guitarist this: "Look, as soon as the public get to see the magic you can do with that guitar, it will be an experience." Chaz Chandler suggested to change the spelling of Jimmy's first name from Jimmy to Jimi, saying to Jimmy that would give it more of an exotic feel to it, especially when the British public starts seeing your name on the record covers and the magazines. Jimmy liked the sound of that and agreed. On the 3rd of October 1966, the Jimi Hendrix Experience had their first jam session together. And then, on the 13th of October 1966, the Jimi Hendrix Experience went on a short 5-day tour of France as the opening act for French singer Johnny Hallyday. And then back to the UK to record Hey Joe on the 23rd of October 1966 at the Delane Lee Studios, 75 Dean Street, Soho, London. Here's Chaz Chandler as he tells us what it was like to record Jimi Hendrix in the studio for the first time during the recording session for Hey Joe.
When we first time we ever went in the studio, we had a terrific row because he had the guitar just so damn loud it was impossible to get it on tape, you know. And we had a big rousing row, but after that he turned the amp down, and we got on very easy in the studio after that. The guy was such a great musician. He was incredibly particular in the sound. You know, those times when he would say to me, "We can get a better sound than that," and I couldn't tell any difference between the new sound he put down and the one he put on. But you know, he was saying, "No, it's not quite clean enough," and all this.
After Jimmy had finished recording his vocal parts, he still felt the song still sounded a little bit flat. Here's Noel Redding to explain more.
And when we got the backing track down and we got his vocal down, and then Chaz threw on these three girls' vocals, which actually made the song, and that's when it started sounding good.
The three-girl backing vocalist, as Noel Redding has tried to explain, were in fact a very experienced group, called the Breakaways, who were actually formed in 1962 and released a single called He's a Rebel, which became a minor hit in the British charts and was written by Gene Pitney. But they were probably better known for recording backing vocals for artists such as Petula Clark for her smash hit Downtown, and for Cilla Black for her 1964 single You're My World. They also recorded backing vocals for Cliff Richard for his entry for the UK for the Eurovision Song Contest of 1968, Congratulations, and for British rock and roll singer Joe Brown, who actually married one of the original members of the group, Vicky Brown, after she left the Breakaways in 1963, who also gave birth to their daughter, Sam Brown, who also became a rather successful recording artist after her hit, Stop, in 1989. When it came down to recording what would be the B-side to the single Hey Joe, Jimmy wanted to do another cover version of Don Covey's Mercy Mercy. But Chaz Chandler encouraged him to record one of his own songs in order to receive song publishing royalties. The song Jimmy came up with and recorded was, in my opinion, one of my favourite songs and should have been the A-side of the single, Stone Free, which was the first time Jimmy had written a song with lyrics, which sounds absolutely brilliant even today, because not only can you hear the old Delta blues in the song, I can also hear the future of rock, like the rebellion and frustration of punk. Chaz Chandler took the master tapes of Hey Joe and Stone Free to Decca Records, where their studios were at 165 Broadhurst Gardens, West Hampstead, London, to see the head A&R man at the time at Decca Records, Dick Rowe, who said after hearing the tapes that he didn't think Jimi Hendrix had anything special, and turned down the chance to sign the Jimi Hendrix Experience. Personally speaking, the reason why I think Dick really turned down the band, because he was still angry at Chaz Chandler, and I think especially with the Animals manager, Michael Jeffrey. Because after Dick Rowe had signed the Animals from arch rivals EMI in late 1965, most of the original members of the Animals only lasted 8 months with the label before splitting up and reforming with new band members and renaming themselves Eric Burdon and the Animals. And yes, for all you Beatles fans out there watching, that was the same Dick Rowe that turned down the Beatles and signed Brian Poole and the Tremolos instead, back in January 1962. But what turned out to be one of the most important gigs for Jimi Hendrix turned out to be on the 25th of November 1966, when the Jimi Hendrix Experience first performed at the Bag O' Nails Club, 9 Kingsley Street, Soho, London, where the group impressed the usual rock stars and actors of the time sitting in the audience, but more importantly, they impressed the managers of The Who, Kit Lambert and Chris Stamp, so much that they wanted to sign the Jimi Hendrix Experience as soon as possible. Here's Chaz Chandler and Chris Stamp to explain how they negotiated the deal to sign the Jimi Hendrix Experience.
Kit Lambert and Chris Stamp were the managers and producers of The Who, and they were in the throes of making a deal with Polydor for distribution of a label which was to be known as Track Records.
You know, we got the SP, we got the fact that, you know, Jimmy was over here with Chaz, and we said, well, can we produce him? you know, we'd love to produce him. And Chaz said, well, I'm going to produce him. We looked at each other and said, has he got a record label? and of course he didn't have a record label, so we immediately, you know, got into the machinations of creating the record label because of Jimmy.
And we sat at the table and literally did a deal on a beer mat for Jimmy to be on Track Records.
And he agreed to pay £1,000 advance for the Jimi Hendrix Experience.
Also, what a lot of people may not realise, that Chris Stamp was also the younger brother of legendary actor Terence Stamp, probably best remembered now for playing General Zod in 2 Superman movies, starring Christopher Reeve as the Man of Steel, and also featuring the great Marlon Brando, playing Superman's father, Jor-El. Hey Joe, with Stone Free on the B-side, was released in the UK on December the 16th, 1966, on a one-off release on Polydor Records. The reason for that was because Track Records were not yet ready to release anything until early 1967. The very early pressings of the single only had Jimmy's name printed on the label instead of Jimi Hendrix Experience, but as soon as Jimi Hendrix saw this, he was furious and demanded that Polydor withdraw the single and reissue it with the group's full title printed on the label. And to be fair, that's exactly what Polydor did, and pretty quickly as well. On the same day the single was released, the Jimi Hendrix Experience also made their television debut on the British pop music show called Ready, Steady, Go, where the Experience performed Hey Joe in front of millions of teenage kids, which helped push up the single right up the UK charts, finally peaking at number 6.